Hey everyone. Um, this is a piece by Steve Wright, Mapping Pathways Within Italian Autonomist Marxism, a Preliminary Survey. I read Steve Wright's book, Storming Heaven, about Italian autonomism, or Italian autonomist Marxism, some time ago, and I remember quite enjoying it and getting something out of it, but I'd like to have a little more, I don't know, being able to map out some of the tendencies within that movement in my head, and that's my motivation for reading this. So let's party. Abstract. Borio, Pazzi, and Ruggiero's edited work of 2005 have characterized apparismo as, quote, neither a homogeneous doctrinaire corpus nor a unitary political subject, end quote, but rather, quote, multiple pathways with their roots in a common theoretical matrix, end quote. Starting with a diagram drawn up by Primo Moroni in the 1980s, this paper will explore a number of the ways in which those paths might be mapped out in terms of key categories, projects, and above all, key categories and projects, above all for the years that followed 1979. The key words are post-apparismo, autonomous Marxism, class analysis, class composition. As usual, I suck at pronunciation. If we were in person, I'd allow you to beat me for every incorrect pronunciation that I made. But since we're not face to face, you can't do that, and I can't allow you to do that. So you'll just have to bear with me. So, okay. And there's a footnote here that says an earlier version of this paper was presented at the Conference on Immaterial Labor, Multitudes, and New Social Subjects, Class Composition, and Cognitive Capitalism, Cambridge University, 29th to 30th, April 2006. I would like to thank two anonymous referees for their critical comments, and Sergio Bianchi and Dorive Aprodi for permission to reprint the map by Primo Moroni. All mistakes are my own. By the early 80s, with the previously close bond between labor process, movement, and theory seemingly broken, the political project known within Italy as apparismo, workerism, appeared to have been smashed, quote, into pieces. At that point, whatever remained appeared to be outside the work of a few isolated individuals, largely a matter of historical curiosity. As Valerio Evangelisti later recalled, by that time, quote, all the best militants were in jail or on the run. We found ourselves with hardly any theorists, There were a few comrades left. The young people who earlier had been with us in consistent numbers, if not all of them, distanced themselves. The response to such a situation was the social centers, but in the sense of their negative side, of an almost natural tendency where the social center became an oasis, a ghetto, even if that wasn't true in every case, end quote. Evangelisti. A decade later, however, the picture had changed significantly within Italy. The preparedness of many in the movement of squatted centers to emerge from their shells and engage with other social forces was matched by a growing intellectual curiosity among new generations of young activists, in part for the practices and ways of seeing that emanated from the operaista experience, but even more so for the contemporary work of some of that tendency's survivors. The contemporary theoretical production commonly referred to avowedly as, quote, post-operaista, took Outlook, which viewed the very different circumstances of the 90s through new categories such as multitude and immaterial labor, or retooled categories as in the case of general intellect. By the beginning of the present decade, this interest in the writings of Italian theorists such as Antonio Negri, Paolo Virno, Franco Berardi had become evident in the English-speaking world as well, whether on the streets with the so-called, quote, anti-global, end quote, movement, or at the sales counters with the publishing success of Empire, the book by Negri and Hart. Furthermore, the interest within and without the Academy for such theorists has also opened a certain space for a new generation of writers/translators/commentators. Footnote: see, for example, the contributors to Henninger, Mechia, and Murphy, edited edition 2007, and Dowling, Nunes, and Trott in 2007, along with issues of The Commoner. End footnote. To put it in Enda Brophy's words, the resurgence of interest in the work of some former participants in operaismo may well testify, quote, to the fact that far from being anachronistic, autonomous thought has demonstrated a tremendously resilient ability to mutate along with the times, end quote. Brophy. The purpose of this paper, then, is to provide some leads for those interested in exploring in further detail what has happened within Italian, quote, autonomist Marxism, end quote, particularly amongst some of its components less well known in the English-speaking world since the defeats at the end of the 70s. The picture can at times be a confusing one. For example, while the likes of Negri, Virno, and Berardi are, for all their differences, now commonly grouped together as, quote, post-operaisti, some of them, their most trenchant critics, likewise trace their roots to Italian workerism. Even among post-operaismo, as a first attempt to, quote, map this camp has noted, it is important to acknowledge the, quote, plurality of stances. And, as will be seen, any such discussion will at times oblige a journey beyond the Italian context. As many writers have indicated, quote, autonomist Marxism has never been a purely Italian phenomenon, and its international diffusion is one of the most distinctive aspects of its development since 1979. If nothing else, this paper will seek to engage in some of the preliminary what the hell is this word? Reconnoit, maybe? RECONNOITRE of the Italian experience, survey the broad lay of the land, poke around in a few nooks and crannies, and from all this compose questions worthy of those braver souls prepared to venture further in exploring what, if anything, from these experiences may be of relevance today. But first, a few cautious concerning labels. If it is common for those who have puzzled over the question to equate Italian, quote, autonomist Marxism with many of the threads stemming from operaismo, it is also worth remembering that A, this label is not typically embraced within such strands, B, these threads hold quite divergent views as to the relationship between their current work and the workerism of the 60s and 70s. Berardi, for example, prefers to speak of, quote, compositionism, referring to the method of reading class composition, while Negri is emphatic that fundamentally new forms of social relations demand a break with conceptual frameworks developed in a different era, starting with operaismo itself. Turning to the person who first coined the term, quote, autonomist Marxism, Harry Cleaver, one finds that his own usage implies something broader than operaismo and its aftermath. Quote, what gives meaning to the concept of, quote, autonomist Marxism as a particular tradition is the fact that we can identify within the larger Marxist tradition a variety of movements, politics, and thinkers who have emphasized the autonomous power of workers, autonomous from capital, from their official organizations, e.g. trade unions, the political parties, and indeed the power of particular groups of workers to act autonomously from other groups, e.g. women from men. By, quote, autonomy, I mean the ability of workers to define their own interests and to struggle for those interests, to go beyond mere reaction to exploitation or to self-defined, quote, leadership, and to take the offensive in ways that shape the class struggle and define the future, end quote. That's by, I believe it's Massimo. It says De Angelis, 1993, but I think it's Massimo De Angelis. De Angelis is his full name. Within such a framework, it can be argued that what made Italian workerism distinctive as a tendency was Italian workerism's formal obeisance to the notion of class composition. even if this commitment was more often honored in the breach by some of the operaisti, for whom it remained, quote, secondary to, quote, great political theory, on the state, the party, the revolution, class, general intellect, and so on. How cohesive, then, was Italian workerism even in its heyday? The extensive primary research carried out since the late 90s by Guido Borio, Francesca Pazzi, and Gigi Rogero bears out their characterization of operaismo as, quote, neither a homogeneous doctrinaire corpus nor a unitary political subject, end quote, but rather, quote, multiple pathways with their roots in a common theoretical matrix, end quote. Seeking at a moment when the tendency had seemingly reached its nadir, Sergio Bologna, I don't know how you say his name right, it might be Bologna, offer the following thoughts on this, quote, common theoretical matrix. I believe above all, that operaismo was an exaltation sometimes uncritical of the working class, but also a great exaltation of power. Operaismo was born not by chance, with operai e capital, which is, I believe, by it's Workers and Capital by Mario Tanti. Not sure. I don't know if that's what it's referring to. It's not clear which was greater, the paean to the working class or that to the capitalist capacity of subsuming this working class from the viewpoint of its components. So it was not by chance that many of its theorists later became theorists of the state and today are only theorists of governability. And I don't believe that we can call the latter traitors, because this eulogy of capital's power, bracket potenza, end bracket, is a risk within operaismo, which later became a eulogy of the power of the political as such, of the autonomy of the political. This is an extremely coherent consequence, I believe, is not some leap, a moment of transformation. In my opinion, it is a logical consequence, end quote. Sergio Bologna. Nor did this dichotomy disappear with the parting of ways that saw Mario Tanti and others embrace the Italian Communist Party at the end of the 60s. Berardi has shown in some detail the manner in which these two spirits played themselves out within Potere Operaio after the hot autumn, while back in the mid-70s, Bologna, who had already chosen a different political trajectory to the likes of Negri, would conclude that a permanent contradiction existed between political organization and class autonomy. And if some of those who championed the project of class autonomy in this period placed their emphasis upon the role of the party, others like Jan Molière Boutang saw things somewhat differently. Quote, naturally, what I liked about the invisible party of Mirafiori was not the party, but rather the invisibility, end quote. Molière Boutang, the, quote, party of Mirafiori, end quote, was a metaphor for the vanguardism of the mass worker popularized in early 70s by Negri. Ironically, one of the strongest affinities binding those who have shared in the tradition of apparismo is precisely a contempt for traditions, particularly, quote, revolutionary traditions, end quote. After all, it was a commonplace within the workerist literature of the 60s and 70s to exalt the discontinuities and leaps both in struggles and in, quote, working class science, end quote, in organizational projects no less than theoretical developments. To put this in the words of Tronti's classic text, Operai e capital, I was right, I'm so smart, all great discoveries, quote, ideas of simple men which seem madness to the scientist, end quote, have been made by, quote, dangerous leaps, end quote, by breaking the, quote, thread of continuity, end quote. With the relationship between autonomy and power, however, this notion of discontinuities could be taken in quite different directions. At one extreme, perhaps, there was Negri's argument in the early 80s celebrating, quote, communist transition, bracket, as absent as, end bracket, absence of money, end quote. Of memory, end quote. And the abandonment of the dialectic as a useful explanatory tool of social antagonism. At the other, Peppino Ortoleva's insistence a few years earlier, in reference to class antagonism in the United States, that, quote, the hegemony of capitalist culture and its version of American history does not translate into a tabula rasa of the, quote, collective memory, end quote, of the American working class. A store of working class traditions remains, but it is the patrimony not of the American proletariat as a whole, but rather disarticulated and sectionalized, of individual groups of workers, of rank and file union experiences, end quote. Etc., end quote. Ortoleva. In trying to take some preliminary stock of all this, before 1979 and after, it will be impossible to survey the terrain properly without reference to the work on operaismo by Borio, Pazzi, and Ruggiero, published in 2002. Their book, Futuro Anteriore, provides a rich and at times provocative overview of key themes within Italian workerism, while its associated CD-ROM of nearly 60 interviews, a selection of which have likewise been published in book form, is the richest single documentary source to date of reflections from participants in the operaista experience. What follows then will draw not only on materials produced across the arc of time from 1980 to 2005, but also some of the reflections captured in the fieldwork of Borio, Pazzi, and Ruggiero. Along the way, it will also seek to illustrate a point made in Enda Brophy's excellent survey of, quote, operaisti after operaismo, recounting an important conference held in Rome in 2002, called in part for the launch of Futuro Anteriore. He reminds us that for all the talk of a, quote, common tradition after 1979, quote, deep differences over key issues of theory and practice have further distanced some of the protagonists of those years from each other, a process which had already started by the end of the 1960s as the level of social conflict in Italy escalated, end quote. Maps. How to map the fallout from the operaismo of the 60s and 70s. A number of different enterprises spring to mind here, maps constructed in terms of tendencies or of projects or of categories. As regards the first approach, Chris Wright has produced a very interesting chart of, quote, different tendencies within libertarian Marxism, end quote, which is useful in situating autonomous Marxism against a broader political and intellectual history. Originally designed to accompany an online text archive now hosted at libcom.org, the stress is placed upon, quote, tracking unique contributions in theory and practice, end quote, while acknowledging that, quote, these are not perfect matches and the relations are in fact much more complex, end quote. I don't know why, but I have a feeling that Chris Wright's involvement in lots of different things is like a kind of like a sort of like invisible labor. I don't know if that's actually true, but I have the suspicion that he's involved in a lot of projects whose name is not highly published. I don't know if that's actually true. I think Chris Wright also has a piece in the book Critical Theory and the Critique of Anti-Semitism on the January 6th storming of the Capitol and its relation to anti-Semitism and anti-blackness, which I think I'm really looking forward to reading. But anyway, Wright's map differentiates between, quote, operaismo 1960 to 1972, quote, autonomia 1972 to 1980, and, quote, autonomous Marxism, while indicating the influence upon each of other currents such as the Johnson-Forrest tendency. The Johnson-Forrest tendency, of course, being the tendency within the Fourth International, that the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States, and the Socialist Workers' Party of the United States, who conceptualized a state capitalist view of the Soviet Union, and its two main figures were, of course, C.L.R. James and Raya Dunayevskaya. Then they went on to publish the newspaper or journal, News and Letters. Anyway, turning to an accompanying discussion document, however, it becomes clearer just how complex some of the relationships have been. Take relations within the English-speaking world between, quote, open Marxism and autonomous Marxism. As Wright himself indicates, quote, depending on who one talks to, open Marxism includes autonomous Marxism, or autonomous Marxism includes open Marxism, though the separation over the importance of Hegel and the question of dialectics seems to provide a basic grounds for differentiating the two tendencies, end quote. Yeah, it seems like Hegel is more important for open Marxism than for autonomous Marxism, who I think are very much anti-Hegelian. Open Marxism is also influenced by developments within West Germany in the theoretical sphere. So like Neue Marxlektura stuff. And the Frankfurt School more generally, whereas autonomous Marxism is not particularly influenced by the Frankfurt School. Although there is a piece about the relationship between Apparismo and the Frankfurt School in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory, but I don't really quite remember the contents of it, but I don't think they were particularly influential. I do think in Germany, though, autonomous Marxism had influence on what's known as a wildcat, which I associate with figures such as Rolf Raucus, I think his name, or Raucus. He wrote the the Communist Road to Capitalism about China, and the thinker the historian Karl Heinz Roth. I think those two individuals are kind of affiliated with autonomous Marxism in Germany, and I think their main journal was Wildcat Germany. I'm not sure about that though. So yeah, there's I think the kind of like the influences that they draw on are definitely distinct between but I think that there's like I think like Antonio Negri, for instance, has like pieces in the four. I don't know which ones, but he has like people who are way more influenced, or even participants like Negri, have articles in the open Marxism journals that came out, and they start coming out in the 90s, I think. They just released one though recently. Another limit in organizing a map in this manner is apparent when we seek some correlation between, quote, tendencies on the one hand and individuals or collectivities on the other. For example, where might we situate Primo Moroni, a quintessential, quote, libertarian Marxist, end quote, within such a diagram? For rather than moving from tendency to tendency over time, as more than a few have done in their political trajectory, Primo Moroni's work was long infused by various strands of what he himself once called the, quote, in this indefinable area that stretches from the Bordigists to the proto-situationists, the councilists to the internationalists, the anarchists to the anarcho-communists, the libertarian communists, end quote. Sevkro Lukovic, 1976. Yeah, there's this map here. I've seen. I think a lot of people who are kind of familiar with this channel have probably seen this map before, but it's just like a map of like libertarian tendencies within libertarian Marxist tendencies. So it doesn't include things like anarchist, which I think might be a mistake, because I think lots of anarchist communist people definitely see the extreme merit in Marxism in a lot of ways, and but yeah. Sorry, I'm just looking at this thing. I should stop looking at that. You can't hear me looking at things. But it has I'll read the caption from the little map here. It says, "This is a rough, quote, family tree, end quote, of the different tendencies within libertarian Marxism, which we hope will help people navigate the text of the site." This is from, I guess, yeah, this is from Libcom. "These are not perfect matches, and the relations are, in fact, much more complex, but it may help people to move through the site. Due to his influence on several tendencies within libertarian Marxism, we include Lenin in the diagram, but not social democracy as a whole, even though it influenced Luxemburg, Lenin, and the original Council Communists. The idea here is not to mention every group, but to track unique contributions in theory and practice." Yeah, there's definitely, people missing. I think there needs to be a place definitely for like Daniel Gorin, for instance. All right. Anyway, all of which leads to a map that Primo Moroni drew up sometime in the late 80s. Moroni had something of a flair for the visual representation of information. Those who have seen his maps charting the placement and displacement of social center spaces in Milan will already be familiar with his handiwork. The, quote, map, end quote, here, however, is different. It seeks to show the connections between the major expressions of revolutionary media in Italy for the 30 years that followed the workers' uprising in Hungary. In doing so, it aims to tell a story across time about space. Not so much geographical space, although that too is hinted at in part, but rather that kind of, quote, space, end quote, that spawned talk of an, quote, area, end quote, of autonomy during the 70s. Yeah, and I can't read this map at all because it's in Italian. But it's very intricate. Let us look at Moroni's map for a moment. For those who have seen them, it recalls a number of other cartographical efforts. One back in an issue of L'Espresso from around 1969 seeks to chart all the political tendencies that passed through or near the student movement of that time. Similar diagrams illustrate Robert Lumley's book States of Emergency and the Red Notes volume Working Class Autonomy and the Crisis. In the latter anthology, the names of leading militants are added to the jumble of political organizations and publications that attempted to challenge the hegemony of the Italian Communist Party during the 70s. I read Lumley's States of Emergency a long time ago. Don't quite remember much of it. I read a couple books on this subject. It's like, for some reason, just like, I feel like a lot of the information didn't stick with me. I suppose probably because I didn't read any of like a lot of the primary source material. Maybe I'd have a better feel for the overall tendency if I had done that. Anyway, Moroni's map, by contrast, is both more austere and in its presentation and more intricate in its detail. As it shows clearly, if the broad array of journals established in the 60s rarely lasted more than 3 or 4 years, they spawned a lush outburst of publications in the 70s, although in many cases not before an interregnum when party-building projects predominated within the Italian far left, and, as the Forest of Arrows highlights, the cross-fertilization between many of these projects was continuous and often, quote, virtuous. That is, the arrows do not by any means represent only a parting of ways within particular circles, but in some cases connections through joint projects or even overlapping membership. A careful examination of Moroni's handiwork suggests a number of other things worthy of note. The first, which is perhaps not so obvious to begin with, are the three vertical columns that constitute the map. Looked at more closely, it becomes possible to discern on the left of the chart projects associated in some way with the libertarian and or countercultural sensibilities within the Italian radical left, from the Situationist and the Collegamenti on the one hand to Renudo and Radio Alice A/Traverso on the other. Another column on the right records projects whose lineage can be variously traced, bearing in mind the significant breaks involved in each stage from the Communist Party of Italy through to Manifesto and the Roman Autonomists. Entranti's associates of Laboratorio Politico made an appearance here for good measure. In the middle column there is the, quote, central trunk, end quote, of Operaismo, passing from Quaderni Rossi and Class Operaia via Portera Operaio, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, to a host of autonomous publications such as Rosso, as well as Primo Maggio, and other enterprises, many of which were linked in some way to Moroni's bookshop, Kaluska. I feel like I had like a cartoonish like Italian accent in the way I'm saying these words, because I just watched like Conan O'Brien and George Schlansky take a trip to fucking Italy, and it's absurd. And like Conan O'Brien's caricature of Italian accents is like in my throat. The second point is that, to Moroni's mind at least, the most important expressions of revolutionary media in Italy by the mid-'80s, those difficult years characterized earlier by evangelisti, were largely on the broadcasting front. There are some notable exceptions, but all the same, it is radio stations such as Onda Rossa and Radio Proletaria in Rome, Sherwood in Padova, and Onda d'Urto in de Urto in Brescia that are to the fore. Worthy of note, too, are, quote, radical metropolitan events, end quote, associated with punk, a movement whose exponents Moroni would develop an extraordinary affinity during these years. This Moroni guy sounds like a man after my own heart. I'd like to know him. Sounds like a cool guy. You really can't exaggerate. I mean, it's kind of corny because, it's like, obviously there's bigger things. But in terms of, like, culture, in terms of, like, way things are conceptualized, you can't, like, really quite over-exaggerate the role of, like, culture in altering the way people think about things, Art has a great, disruptive quality that, allows people to tear things apart in their own minds and look at them anew. And I think punk rock, and amongst other, just fucking the counterculture of the 60s and things like that, has a great power, at least, personal experience is like of, shaking people up and making them think differently. And sometimes it's, obviously we're operating within a capitalist society and it can so, quote, be, quote, co-opted, but like, it's not like, culture exists in some kind of like totally unsold out sphere prior to it being commodified. It's like I remember sorry, just as a side note, but I remember that guy fucking Doug Lane from what's it called? Sublation Media. He was like Zero Books. I don't know what the current thing is, but he's talking to is it Tom Bunyard? I can't sure, but one of the guys who wrote who's recently written books on like Guy Debord, and he was talking the guy. Maybe it's not Tom Bunyard, but let's just assume it's Tom Bunyard, saying how he discovered Guy Debord and the Situationists via punk rock, and one of the first radical things he read was the Society of the Spectacle, and Debord Lanes makes some comment about how punk was really just like wasn't it really just like a highly commodified cultural space, and it's like Yeah, of course, but punk rock is not reduced to fucking, never mind the Bullocks and fucking London Calling. It's a whole cultural sphere that transcends the, just its most obvious cultural manifestations. Um, yeah. The 1960s were way more, the counterculture in the 1960s represented way more than, I don't know, Jefferson Airplane playing White Rabbit, which is a fucking tremendous song. I fucking love that song. Sorry, that's not what you're here to listen to. If you're, I don't know why you're here, but you might just think my voice is really sexy sounding, which is a great reason to listen to me talk. Okay, why labor over this map? One reason is that it may be worth considering what can be learned by attempting to extend Moroni's map forward 20 years into our own decade. Any such effort would need to address the radical media that became so important by the 90s, not simply the internet, but also the new generation of publications that circulated at that time, alongside the network of electronic bulletin boards often associated with individual social centers that interpenetrated with those journals. A very partial mapping of the early 90s would note publications like Luogo Comune, Clinamen, Riff Raff in Padua, but also the journal of the same name, but not Orientation in Turin. Alt Veragioni, some of whose editors had been active in earlier publications such as Primo Maggio and Saper, the workplace-oriented Incompatibili, with its mixture of leaflets and reflective essays. Nor shall we forget the likes of Virus in Turin and Zero Network in Veneto, both of which attempted to make accessible to those not online debates and reflections circulating in the European Counter Network and other electronic forums. Some old stalwarts of the 70s would also be there, such as Collegamenti and, for the first part of the decade, Autonomia Padua. Last but not least, this flowering on the media front was also fueled by a new engagement between a younger generation of activists and participants from movements of earlier decades. Whereas in the 80s, as Sandra Metzadra, I'm saying that name right, called it was, quote, rather difficult to establish links with such people, quote, a bit because many of them were in prison or out of the country, a bit because the others, at least in my experience, were not particularly disposed, end quote. Now the social centers and other movement spaces hosted a range of seminars and enabled just such encounters. On the journal front, both Antveragioni and Derive Aprodi, which regrouped some of the Luogo Commune's participants with a rather broader circle, epitomized this new encounter between those formed in the 60s and those who entered politics only afterwards. At the same time, it may be that a different kind of mapping is needed, one that attempts to trace out the development of particular categories and concepts since the 80s. For example, a review of some of the key categories used to understand the nature of social subjectivity over the past generation or so of post-operaisti might start with a category popularized by Negri and others in the 70s, operaio social, or the social worker, I think is the translation, and end with multitude, the dominant term for the past decade or more within this broad array of political thought. And while they continue to be used and are of interest in their own right, other terms such as mass intellectuality and general intellect can also be seen as bridges from operaio social. I don't know if it's sociala. I don't know if you say the E, pronounce the E at the end of Italian words. I feel like you do. Maybe I'm wrong. To multitude, especially in the late 80s and early 90s, when movements such as the Pantera within higher education prompted some circles to engage in new reflections concerning the nature of intellectual labor. The picture that emerges from the effort of trying to encompass the gamut of those ways of seeing touched in some important way by apparismo and its fallout is a broad panoply of social figures. The next section will briefly explore each of these categories in turn, since they can tell us a lot about developments within the fallout from operaismo since 1980 or thereabouts. For the moment, we can note that whatever else, most are recognizable as class figures implying particular relationships with capital. In its earliest use, perhaps, quote, multitude might have been more ambiguous in this sense, but there were always exponents of the term who insisted on multitude's class nature. For example, the editors of De Rive a Prodi, while Negri has also been heard in recent years arguing that multitude is a class category. The next part of this paper, then, will review some of this material, conscious that much remains to be done in developing a proper understanding of the wealth, as well as limitations of the various trends that have descended from operaismo's collapse a generation ago. This is figure 3. I feel like I should try to at least say the words that are in it. Some of the concepts being used would be mass worker, the unwaged, aparaillo social, mass intellectuality, general intellect, immaterial labor, multitude, species being, self-employed workers, transport workers, the diffuse worker. Diffuse worker and the self-employed workers are two concepts. One is transport workers, public sector workers, precarious workers, call center workers, jobbers, migrant workers, hyperproletariat, cognitariat. And there's a footnote here. If what follows focuses on the contours of certain class figures, I have tried in Wright 2007 to explore more explicitly the relationship of some of them within capital. For example, is spelled out in the debate around the efficacy or otherwise of post-Fordism and general intellect as explanatory categories. On this score, see also a number of other contributions to Dowling, Nunes, and Trott. Edited volume 2007. Okay, I'm going to take a break here. After 1980, the first class subject in Figure 3 is the, quote, mass worker, the great protagonist of Italy's, quote, hot autumn. Here some of the most fascinating work was carried out in the aftermath of the 1980 Fiat defeat, often by editors of the journal Primo Maggio, culminating with Marco Rovelli's magisterial history of Lavorare in Fiat. But can the mass worker be dismissed as a subject of purely historical interest? Guido Bianchini, once pointed out that, quote, the end of development in one place is development somewhere else, end quote, and the past 20 years have certainly seen mass workers place their stamp upon a range of once, quote, peripheral social formations from Korea to South Africa. Another important exploration of class composition after 1980, again spearheaded by some members of Primo Maggio, concerned workers in the transportation sector. Indeed, the journal's work in this area can be seen as anticipating significant cycles of struggle that continue into the present day. As with the mass worker, however, much of the attention paid over the past 20 years to the significance of transport workers in terms of class struggle has typically been the work of other political tendencies. While Primo Maggio would finally close its doors in the late 80s, a number of its editors have continued with research into working class history. Sergio Bologna, for example, has produced studies of German workers and Nazism, as well as the development of class composition in Italy. As always, with historical research conducted by exponents of the, quote, school of class composition, contemporary political concerns were never far away. Indeed, for Bologna, much of his important labor-related research since the 80s has addressed a social subject quite removed from those examined by operaismo in its glory days. The self-employed worker, whose numbers in Italy had increased markedly by the early 90s. As he put it at one of the public meetings called to discuss the research of Borio, Pazzi, and Voghero, quote, self-employed labor, to go back to a theme dear to my heart, is no longer capable of that conflict of which operaismo conceived, that is, of workplace conflict, bracket, conflitto sindicale, end bracket, as conflict par excellence. Not because it is not so disposed subjectively, but because the structure of the relations of production has changed. So a pedigree workerist, bracket, leaperista doc, end bracket, would cancel self-employed labor from the list of subjects and treat it as the multitude's swamp and the vendei. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word, but that's in reference to the peasant revolt against the French Revolutionary government. I'm not sure. I can't remember what year it is, but it's something that is referenced a lot to refer to, like, I don't know, the reactionary revolts of backward sectors of the population, I suppose. But anyway, that's the end of the quote from Bologna. In the mid-80s, many surviving Italian, quote, pedigree workerists took heart from the COBAS phenomenon, COBAS, wherein networks of unofficial rank-and-file groupings primarily based in the public sector, first and foremost railway staff and teachers, challenged both their employers and the traditional role of unions in representing employees' interests within the wage relation. While articles on the COBAS can be found across the ex-workerist and left-libertarian press of the time, it was in those journals with a particular focus upon the paid workplace, such as Collegamenti and Incompatibili, that the most space was devoted to the new groupings, along with the so-called alternative unions which rubbed shoulders with them in the 90s. With similar movements appearing in France and Spain, the question of such workers' struggles against restructuring, their potentialities for extension into the private sector, the corporatist temptation which they faced, meant that the circumstances of public sector employees were often to the fore within concrete class composition analyses carried out in the years that spanned the mid-80s to the early 90s. As Paolo Virno has argued, the experience of the, quote, movement of 77 left a vast range of questions unanswered, questions which would resurface again from the 80s around discussions of social conflict in a time of so-called, quote, post-Fordism. In terms of the meaning of political recomposition, such questions included matters of representation and organization. In terms of changes within class composition, they included the growing importance for capitalist accumulation of labor processes, apparently outside the Fordist workplace regimes that had engendered the mass worker. One of these key concepts raised in and around 1977, only to make a significant resurgence in the last decade, is that of precarity. The matter continued to concern the likes of Collegamenti and Primo Maggio in the early 80s, where attention was often centered upon those employed on short-term work projects provided for government authorities. In terms of a continued practical reference point for this concept within Italy, the struggles of precarious workers wove themselves in and out of a number of broader social conflicts as the 80s progressed, starting with the education sector. By the mid-90s, quote, precarity had become a theme taken up by a section of the social centers movement, an early manifestation of the Tutte Bianche. Was it as activists around casualized working conditions with whom a younger generation of workerist influenced theorists were engaged. I think those people wear like big white suits or something. I'm not sure what the hell they do. The exploration of casual workers' experience was also a central theme for a German circle that took up class composition analysis in the 80s. Some of the editors of Wildcat later explained this process to John Holloway as follows. Like I said, yeah, the Wildcat Germany being like in reference to German reception of Italian operaismo, politically and both and theoretically. Quote, in the beginning of the 1980s, the cycle of factory worker struggles was over, but for many young people it was inconceivable to adjust to wage labor and to work away at a job until reaching pension age. Additionally, we ourselves refused to strive individually through a professional career for a better place in the capitalist hierarchy. Out of this grew the practice of jobbing, to do any old shitty job for a short time in order then to have time for ourselves, for political struggle, and for pleasure. In formal terms, we worked under conditions that would later be characterized by the sociologist as, quote, precarious, in the sense of being vulnerable to one-sided measures by capital. But it was even easier then to use the regulations of labor law and the welfare state for our own needs. End quote. Wildcat, 1997. This initial stance shifted significantly as the decade advanced. Elsewhere among the various fragments of workerism, a variety of stances emerged on the question of precarious labor. For example, one former member of the North American journal Zero Work could be heard arguing in the mid-80s that a critical engagement with the informal economy might also provide a, quote, basis for social autonomy, end quote. In contrast, Sergio Bologna's comments at a 1984 Canadian conference on operaismo and autonomia characterized the notion of, quote, precarious labor as self-liberation, end quote, as no more than a passing phase doomed to extinction with the shakeout of the informal economy itself. Circumstances surrounding casual or precarious work would be rather different again by the late 90s, when a younger generation connected to Wildcat developed links with small groups elsewhere in Europe and initiated a workers' inquiry into conditions for call center workers. While their efforts would provoke controversy in some quarters, they can also be seen as an important spur to a new and welcome round of inquiry and co-research undertaken in recent years. In terms of movements, work around precarity has likewise been fundamental to the networks that have made such a success of Euromede of late. Then again, as Angela Mitropoulos has argued, if precarious labor has in fact been the norm rather than the exception during the capital relations history, then perhaps in certain cases, quote, the recent rise of precarity is actually its discovery among those who had not expected it, end quote, given their blindness to long-standing hierarchies within waged and unwaged labor. In the 70s, quote, migrant worker, end quote, was almost another way of saying, quote, mass worker within the operaista lexicon, and a number of studies on the subject appeared in the Materiali Marxisti book series and elsewhere. As Jan Moulier-Boutang makes clear, however, even during workerism's heyday, the differing circumstances between Italy and elsewhere paid short shrift to any attempt to transpose insights mechanically from one social formation to the other, particularly in terms of understanding what migration might mean for the process of class recomposition. Quote, I have not yet spoken of an encounter with an encounter that was decisive for me, that with the comrades of immigration. In fact, the question of immigration interested our Italian comrades, especially of those of potere apparaio, or apparaio. Italian immigration was interesting as a mode of propagation, but it was not the theoretical problem of immigration as a fracture, bracket, spaccatura, end bracket, within class composition as a real problem of the latter. I remember that it was difficult to explain to our comrades at Fiat or to Romano Alquati that having 22 nationalities is not the same thing as having one Italian working class. Even if there were Italians from the South, it was something different. And then 300 Tunisians were hired at Fiat in 73. I remember perfectly that I said to Alquati, to Tony, and to others that this phenomenon needed to be watched closely because it was very important. That they did not was, I think, a great error, ... end quote. Moulier Boutang, 2002. He adds, quote, to my mind, even if it is, this is a footnote, to my mind, even if it is naturally easy to revise history, still everything that followed this radicalization of the white working class, including the CUBs, then the Brigate Rosa, and the other armed groups happened when the invisible party was no longer such within the class composition, because it had already dissolved into various situations, and bosses had a plan to decompose everything completely to defeat it. I don't remember how many immigrant workers there were at the time, but certainly in the Fiat defeat of 80, they were already an important variable in the territory. It's a shame because we truly could have organized things and changed this dynamic a bit. End quote. Boutang. Moulier Boutang's own work has long centered upon workers and migration, and in Italy itself, particularly since the beginning of the 90s, there have been a number of important studies of migrant workers undertaken by those informed in some way by the legacy of Italian workerism. Some of the researchers concerned, such as Sandro Mezzadra, view matters from perspectives not inconsistent with the broad post-operaista framework. Others, such as Gambino and Devi Sacchetto, can be numbered amongst those least sympathetic to what has come to be styled, quote, post-workerism. In its detailed dissection of the dissolution and reconstitution of communities in the wake of the Balkan Wars, Sacchetto's study of the Northeast and its Orient drew upon the work of Moulier Boutang and others to illustrate the proposition that, quote, the more or less free movement of migrants is a struggle against the labor market, end quote. For Sandra Mezzadra, it was likewise an encounter with the research of Moulier Boutang alongside his own political work in Genoa, which brought home an understanding of migrants as active agents rather than simply passive victims at the mercy of their circumstances. According to Mezzadra, the circumstances of migrant workers can be seen as emblematic within contemporary class composition so long as one avoids reductionist temptations. Quote, we cannot get rid of, quote, generalizing concepts precisely because we are aware of their limits, which are the limits of a commonality which cannot be stressed at the expense of the plurality of particular subject positions which defines the composition of living labor. In this way, we can talk, for example, of migrant labor as a subjective figure which shows an element of commonality which is shared by the whole of contemporary living labor. That is, a general attitude to mobility and flexibility, the subjective counterpart of the, quote, flexible regime of accumulation, end quote, described, for instance, by David Harvey, without for this reason on the one hand sacrificing the subjective and objective peculiarity of the experience of mobility by migrants and on the other hand, forgetting the radical diversity of migrants' experience itself, end quote. Metsadra. Thus far, the social subjects explored have each had a certain sectoral specificity for all the claims that might be made on their behalf in terms of commonality. Before turning briefly to the category, quote, multitude, I want to address two concepts that others with an operaista past have engendered in their efforts to construct a more global reading of class composition today. The first of these is the, quote, hyperproletariat, a term coined by Romano Alquati, along a subterranean influence with some of the social centers in Turin. Alquati's writings have continued to appear largely through small publishing houses across the 80s and 90s. Alongside detailed reflections upon the techniques of co-research, Alquati's work has advanced a distinctly original approach to class analysis, the origins of which can be traced back to his ruminations in the 70s on the proletarianization of intellectual labor. For Alquati, the hyperproletariat must be understood as, quote, a great metaclass, end quote, that today is instantiated in a range of moments. So many moments, in fact, that it seems to have disappeared, at least within the self-awareness of its members, who perceive themselves instead as part of a, quote, enormous multitude, made up of seemingly diverse and sometimes counterposed interests, encompassing the unemployed and many of the formerly self-employed. The hyperproletarians, according to Alquati, currently endorse circumstances wherein they, quote, admire, exalt, copy, fetishize means and technologies and machines in particular, even in work. They are convinced that means are more capable than they are. They are mistaken, end quote. For Alquati, nothing less than a, quote, hypercommunism, end quote, is needed to achieve, quote, the suppression of the hyperproletariat, even as multitude, end quote. Franco Berardi's notion of the, quote, cognitariat, end quote, has certain points of convergence with Alquati's work, especially in the attention paid to the subsumption of intellectual capacities to capital, as well as its curiosity as to what that subsumption might mean for the psyche. But like other post-operaista approaches, many of the most important premises informing Berardi's outlook are quite alien to Alquati's insistence upon retaining Marx's category of value as a central explanatory device. Evolving from earlier reflections upon, quote, the virtual class, that is, the cycle of globalized mental labor, end quote, Berardi's is an optimistic view that sees possibilities for the self-organization of, quote, cognitive labor in the wake of the dot-com crash and global opposition to the current war in Iraq. This cognitariat is narrower, however, than the multitude. Perhaps it is the, quote, online facet of the immaterial labor described by Lazzarato and others. At the same time, Berardi's analysis is far from being an uncritical celebration of so-called, quote, virtual culture. As Berardi argued in a 2002 interview, quote, the idea of the cognitariat, of the, quote, cognitarian as a member of the cognitariat, is connected to the idea that during the last years, perhaps the last decade, we lost touch with our body, with our social body and our physical erotic body. Net culture and all the new forms of digital production and new media have erased our relationship with our social body, but at the time of social and economic crises, we are forced to take account of the fact that we do have a body, that in fact we do have a social and physical body. Cognitarians are the workers of the virtual production. There is a moment when cognitarians can become aware of the fact that they are not purely virtual. Cognitarians are not purely economic. Cognitarians also are physical bodies, end quote. Berardi. The central role of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri in shaping and popularizing the term, quote, multitude is unquestionable. Along with its counterpart, quote, empire, multitude has been adopted as an explanatory tool by a range of circles in Europe and beyond, not surprisingly, and again, like empire, it has also been the subject of considerable controversy, not only in the eyes of those left currents that continue to see the world through the lens of Marxist and Leninist orthodoxies, but also for many in what might be termed the libertarian and antagonistic lefts. These debates are well known, and the literature on the subject is already extensive. What is more relevant for the discussion here are the sometimes complex yet discernible bonds that link multitude to a number of earlier categories, from appareil social, social worker, to mass intellectuality. Trying to unravel the linkage leads to a number of debates in both Italy and beyond, involving not only Hart and Negri, but also the likes of Paolo Virno and many of the authors who have been associated in some way with the journal Derive a Prodi. With Virno, for example, there are nuances that resonate differently to some of those central to Hart and Negri's work. Amongst other things, Virno wants to address what Ariana Beauvais and Eric Empson have called, quote, the dark side of the multitude, end quote, and it would be remiss not to mention at this point Nick Dyer Whittiford's rereading of the categories multitude, general intellect, and immaterial labor through the prism of Marx's concept of species being, which has also been advanced by critical engagements with the work of Hart and Negri. The last category, concerning social subjectivity, may well be the least known of those under discussion, at least within Italy itself, although some forums such as the 90s journal Altreragioni provided space for arguments emanating from this camp. During the hot autumn, Potere Apparaio, had summarized that behind regimes of feudal rights in Italian agriculture might be found very modern relationships of power between capital and labor. Challenged within its own ranks over the significance of reproduction for class conflict, the majority within Potere Apparaio was unable to make a similar leap in either theory or practice. On the other side of the Atlantic, however, the implications of this new politics would be taken rather more seriously. Since the late 70s, alongside workerist feminists such as Leopoldina Fortunati, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, and Silvia Federici, and in the light of mass struggles over reproduction and land, North Americans associated first with Zero Work and then Midnight Notes have offered an original reading of class composition that, in positing the centrality of unwaged work, whether in the home or in subsistence farming, has paid particular attention to struggles over debt, energy, and enclosures. It also involves a critique of those positions within Zero Work that, like post-operaismo, in later times, argued that capital had somehow slipped loose from the yoke of value relations. As George Kafensis explained to the Greek circle TPTG, quote, once you saw that the unwaged sector of the working class is really the foundation of the accumulation process, then a new priority inevitably develops, ... Introducing unwaged workers is not a matter of a contest over who is of, quote, more or less importance, end quote, or of who is more or less exploited, but of having a better understanding of what keeps capitalism alive. Once you bring into focus the largely unwaged part of the reproduction cycle of labor power, then your politics change dramatically. You immediately have to deal with divisions and hierarchies that are often neglected by working class movements and are even engineered into working class organizations. One merely has to glance at the scandalous history of working class racism and sexism to get the point, end quote. There's a footnote here that I missed. It just says, alongside the efforts of Midnight Notes, we can also note the work carried out since the late 70s by Harry Cleaver, covering a range of topics from the politics of debt to engagement with the Zapatistas. A useful overview can be found in the preface to the second edition of his Reading Capital Politically, which is a really good book. It's not very long either. Anyway, unpacking after end footnote. Unpacking the category, quote, unwaged, while no simple matter, would be a useful future exercise, nor can it be assumed that all who privilege this category agree upon the politics bound up with it. For example, there have been significant differences among workerist feminists concerning demands such as wages for housework. More recently, writers such as Maria Rosa Dalla Costa have come to rethink the nature of class relations in the light of indigenous movements' efforts to reclaim a non-capitalist relationship with the land, raising questions far beyond potere operaio's tentative reflections. If anything, the unexpected arrival of the Zapatistas on the global scene has only further stimulated work around these perspectives, which can now be found online at websites such as The Commoner. So there you have it, a whole menagerie of social figures, many of which overlap in content while often differing in meaning. This raises another question: is all of this primarily about the search for a privileged layer within class composition, one that can assert its hegemony over the class as a whole? Monty Neal and other members of Midnight Notes have long been emphatic on this score. If much of the operaismo of the 60s and 70s entailed efforts, quote, in analyzing or searching out class vanguards, end quote, to do a class composition analysis, end quote, today means, quote, not to locate a new vanguard, but to help the many class sectors come together, end quote, in quote, the class struggle to cease to be proletarian, end quote. One useful future exercise, therefore, would be to interrogate the various accounts of the social subjects above from this perspective. Another would be to explore the contemporary meaning of the old workerist category of, quote, cycle of struggles and its relationship to, quote, development. Can an ongoing dialectic still be posited between the two, as some world system theorists have done, or has the bond connecting them snapped forever? In either case, what are the implications for a project of social autonomy aimed at dissolving the capital relation altogether, rather than surviving within it as amenably as possible? Only connect. Quote, only connect. Opening up channels of communication internationally, this is at least as urgently on the Italian agenda in the 1980s as it was in the early 1960s, in spite of a new dimension of massive arrest, authoritarian threats, and attempts to atomize collective interest, end quote. Gambino. With these words, Ferruccio Gambino closed his brief 1981 account of Italian links to other revolutionary experiences since the days of Socialisme ou Barbarie and Correspondence. Socialisme ou Barbarie is, of course, the journal that I have a lot of pieces from, with prominent figures being Claude Lafleur and Cornelius Castoriadis. And Correspondence, I think that's referring to International Council Correspondence, which is obviously oriented. I think it was to my understanding, it's kind of like a network of council communists thinking in the pre-war, and maybe sometime in the post-war era. I'm not sure. And if thanks to this and other texts we now know something about such engagements, a lot more work needs to be done in tracing the role of those individuals like Gambino, Silvia Federici, Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, Ed Emery, Harry Cleaver, John Merrington, and others who before and after 1979 provided gateways through which reflections upon workers' theory and practice could pass in and out of the English-speaking world. If interesting work was undertaken by operaismo-influenced writers in a number of other countries during the 70s, these tended nonetheless to be overshadowed by developments within Italy itself. That situation changed after 1979, while much translation was undertaken of certain Italian materials in the early 80s, in many cases inseparable from solidarity work with those authors in prison. One of the consequences of repression from the 7th of April onwards was a heightened geographical expansion and theoretical reflection and research marked by some kind of, quote, operaista perspective. In part, this stemmed from the diaspora of intellectuals in exile, above all to France, but also elsewhere in Europe or the Americas. But it was also the case that the reverses suffered by exponents of autonomous Marxism within Italy drew attention, for those who still cared, to the work of their compatriots in other places. France, of course, assumed a preeminent role early on as a center for the unfolding theoretical aftermath of Appareismo, especially with the sustained engagement between Negri, Deleuze, and Guattari. By the end of the 80s, the French connection would be taken to a new level with the founding of the journal Futur Antérieur, which was also involved in encounter with others, such as Jean-Marie Vincent, whose background lay in Trotskyism. Jean-Marie Vincent, if you don't know, was probably one of the most one of the people who introduced like Frankfurt School critical theory largely to the French scene, and I think he's kind of comparable to like people like Robert Kurz or Anselm Joppa, like kind of like not value form analysis but value critique. That would be like oriented around journals like Crisis and whatnot, and Exit. Jean-Marie Vincent has a book called Abstract Labor, a Critique, which I've never read but might be interesting to read. Other enterprises attempted in exile proved less fruitful, recounts Elisa Del Rey, quote, due to the differences we had interiorized at the end of the 70s, end quote. In the Britain of the late 80s and early 90s, there were resonances with the so-called, quote, open Marxism of John Holloway, Werner Bonafelt, and others, some of whose theorists also made explicit reference to earlier council communist traditions. I believe John Holloway wrote an introduction to a Pannekoek essay in like Capital and Class. I think also, Werner Bonafelt says like, the one glimmer of light in a disastrous 20th century was the council form, and this council communist group that I was like not group but discussion circle that I was kind of like loosely a part of for about 10 seconds. Their big reading project recently has been reading John Holloway's Change the World Without Taking Power, and what's it, Hope in Hopeless Times, or whatever his new book is called. Anyway, within Italy in the early 80s, the Giorno Metropoli can be seen with hindsight as something of a precursor of post-Appareismo, bringing together figures such as Virno and Berardi, whose paths had often been quite separate in the times of autonomia organizzata. Prison, too, proved a space that sometimes enabled new intellectual and personal bonds, closing pre-existing distances based upon political alignment or age, forging friendships between the likes of Sergio Bianchi and Luciano Ferrari Bravo that would have their own significance in the years to come. I have some footnotes here. First is more recently, the website of the French language publication Multitudes has hosted a variety of materials that continue and extend some of the work of Futur Intérieur while making increasing numbers of text available in English. The other footnote says, see Wright forthcoming for a discussion of intergenerational relations within the Italian radical left of the 80s and 90s. Okay, end of the footnotes. Growing access to the internet complicated the picture still further a decade later. By then, we can also see efforts to bring understanding of autonomous Marxism developed elsewhere to bear upon the Italian scene. Here is how Massimo De Angelis recalled the early days of the journal Vis-a-Vis. Quote, I thought that just as the impact of Appareismo and Italian Marxism represented a breath of fresh air for American Marxism, opening it to the thematics of subjectivity, reproposing in Italy a series of works from American autonomous Marxism, which was sensitive and open to a series of thematic lefts in the margins by us. The thematics left in the margins by us. could in return contribute positively to going beyond musty-old diatribes and rigid political and theoretical attitudes, end quote. Massimo De Angelis. Whether that particular exercise proved successful remains a matter of debate. On the other hand, as Enda Brophy has pointed out, for more than a decade there has been an engagement between certain English-language writers in communication studies and some Italian theorists identified with post-operaismo. Perhaps the emblematic text here on the English-language side is Nick Dyer Whiteford's Cybermarks, published in 1999. From the Italian side, Franco Berardi, whose own reflections frequently percolate into English via media activist channels intrigued with his work in Telestreet and elsewhere, has demonstrated a similar interest in Dyer Whiteford's writings. Less well known among English language readers, yet of great relevance in this regard, is Christian Marazzi's work on the place of language in contemporary production, collective identity, and conflict. Was Christian Marazzi the one who did the Violence of Financial Capitalism book? Like Semiotext. Semiotext was all the hot shit when I first got into interested in radical politics. They put out the Invisible Committee and Tikkun stuff, and then just other stuff from I don't know, French theory and shit. If the threads of autonomous Marxism had become even more diffuse by the 90s, there were nonetheless some fora which served as points of encounter. Without question, the most successful of these was the journal Therive a Prodi, which for much of its existence was an important crossroads for encounters between different viewpoints from the many strands stemming from Apparismo, and the place of a certain contamination and dialogue between them and other experiences. In its final issue, Therive a Prodi extended its gaze beyond Italy to examine social conflicts across the globe in the wake of the, quote, movement of movements. For its part, the journal Oltreragioni challenged restorationist and revisionist sentiments within historiography, while devoting much space to discussions of war and migration, as well as new work regimes and the struggles they inspired. In their account of Apparismo, Borio, Pazzi, and Ruggiero argue that at its peak, the tendency established a mechanism through which the ideas of a small band of theorists was transmitted via a diffuse layer of cadres to a broad mass movement. Footnote. In terms of the first groups, Borio, Pazzi, and Ruggiero speak of, quote, that restricted number of subjects with an effective autonomy of research and capacity for political proposition, end quote, end footnote. Whatever the accuracy of their assertions, no one could seriously advance such claims about the relationship between the theoretical strands of Italian autonomous Marxism and the movements that have emerged since the 80s. All the same, certain linkages can sometimes be traced, especially since the 90s, but while the differences amongst certain autonomous Marxist frameworks during the 90s paralleled in part differences within the revived Italian movement itself, anyone with personal experience of such matters can say how imperfect such resonances could sometimes be. To take one example, by the mid-90s, a growing affinity could be detected between Antonio Negri and the political formation descended from the dominant autonomist faction in the Veneto 20 years before. On one fundamental level, however, that of self-defined political identity, important contrasts could still be seen, with Negri continuing to claim the mantle of communism, while the circles around Radio Sherwood and the, quote, Rete Autonoma del Nord-Est, end quote, typically abandon that label. Finally, it must not be thought that many of the connections being established or reestablished after 1979 were only the work of threads emanating from the central trunk of Apparismo. In the 80s, collegamenti translated materials not only from Wildcat in Germany, but also Processed World in the U.S. Alongside the importance it assigned to struggles in Africa, Midnight Notes on the East Coast expressed an early interest in the Swiss autonomous movement, while the book Bolo Bolo by a Swiss editor of the journal found a certain resonance with Processed World on the West Coast. And in Britain, one of the most consistent interlocutors with Apparismo and its aftermath has been the editorial collective of Aufheben. Or Alphaben. No, it's Aufheben, right? Yeah. A journal whose sensibilities are informed by left communism as much as anything else. Wrapping things up for now. Quote, my answer is, quote, it depends, ... end quote. Romano Alquati. I would like to end on a provocative note. First, with some thoughts about the varying understandings of a few other key terms in text, then with some comments taken from the interviews carried out for Futuro Anteriori. There are a number of points of reference that, whatever the passage of years, remain as crucial markers for understanding what has happened in so-called autonomous Marxism since 1979. Let us start with Marx's, quote, fragment on machines, which first made its appearance in Italian in the pages of Quaderni Rossi. Here it is hard to resist saying the following, quote, tell me your views on the, quote, fragment on machines, and I'll tell you your views on everything else, end quote. Many readers will have encountered some other post-operaista treatment of this text, perhaps that provided by Paolo Virno, which dovetails with his reading of Marx's category, quote, communism of capital, end quote, and can discern easily enough the political consequences that stem from those interpretations. But there are other, lesser known readings that also deserve consideration. Some may also be aware of Alquati's continued insistence that the key consequence of Marx's line of argument in this section of the Grundrisse is that capital cannot escape socially necessary labor times function at the heart of its own valorization. But what can we make of his assertion back in 1977 that follows? Quote, above all, Marx is not speaking here of the future, but of the capitalist system of his time, of the factory as the factory functioned then. Marx is not speaking, in fact, of the end of capitalist valorization, but of a passage within the real subsumption of the textile industry towards the middle of the 19th century, end quote. Footnote. For a critique of Negri's abandonment of the category socially necessary labor time as a means of understanding contemporary capitalism, see Henninger, 2007. Another theme worthy of exploration is the borrowing from other social theories by strands emerging from the wreckage of Apparismo. Some of this ground has been well covered, particularly in terms of engagement with French theory, but how many commentators reach back before 1979 to examine in detail the French connection to, quote, Mao Dadaism and, quote Mao Dadaism in Bologna. Other terrain is less well known. For example, how did the category of post-Fordism become a fundamental explanatory device for so many of the ex-workers' strands after 1979? Unlike the debate within the English-speaking world, much of it in the academy, especially in and around the world of radical geography, where those who adopted this term as a useful explanatory tool often saw post-Fordism as a positive development for workers. Former workers in Europe have tended both to embrace the category while imbuing the category with largely negative connotations. Footnote. See Wright 2007 for a brief discussion of affinities and dissonances amongst ex-operaisti when addressing the theme of post-Fordism. Tajani and Ruggiero 2005 provided a very useful summary of what in the post-operaista debate is seen as the key features of the transition to post-Fordism. 1. Quote, the passage from a productive system based upon largely vertically integrated production units to a territorially diffuse system of production which with reticularly articulated small units, end quote. 2. Quote, the growing weight of formally self-employed and independent labor, with the accentuation of various forms of flexibility parallel to the progressive reduction of employed labor and growing casualization of jobs, end quote. 3. Quote, the more general tendency towards the multiplication of employment regimes even within situations of analogous work or equivalent job roles, end quote. 4. Quote, the increased requirement in the production process, including within large factories, for cognitive, relational, linguistic, communicative, and other faculties, including those called, quote, immaterial, end quote. Quote, 5. Quote, the refurbished importance of the IT revolution as instrument and paradigm of networked production, end quote. 6. Quote, the structural permanence of quotients of employed labor deployed in the lowliest, most degrading jobs, often undertaken by male and female migrant workers in particularly oppressive conditions, end quote. End footnote. Only Ferruccio Gambino, to my knowledge, has explicitly rejected the term as a, quote, rather blunt instrument, end quote. Post-Fordism. Thus, where others see the, quote, smooth world, end quote, of empire, Gambino sees a growing regionalization of capitalist blocks within which a diversity of strategies are deployed to secure the subordination of the, quote, labor factor, end quote. Quote, not the transition to a post-Fordist model, but a continuous recombination of old and new elements of domination in order to decompose labor power politically within a newly flexibilized system of production, end quote. This notion of a, quote, continuous recombination of old and new elements of domination, end quote, is echoed in the work of an associate of Gambino, Massimiliano Tamba, who has sought to dehistoricize and subject to critique the reading of formal and real subsumption that post-operaismo has developed from earlier workers' debates around Marx's critique of political economy. That so much remains in contention concerns operaismo's... Sorry, 1 second. Okay. I thought I stopped recording for a second. That so much remains in contention concerning operaismo's legacy is thrown into relief by 3 brief fragments from the Futuro Anteriore interviews. The first observation belongs to Mario Dalmaviva, one of the many participants in the operaista adventure who deserves to be better known outside Italy and who characterized the state of play back in February 2001 in these terms, quote, in my opinion, there was a great social revolution in Italy. It didn't become a political revolution as we had wanted, and yet it happened, and it prompted a ferocious reaction from the other side, bracket, controparte, end bracket, that's continued up until the present day. They won, but not only don't they know where they're going, they don't even know where they are. The problem is that we don't know either, end quote. Hello. The second comment is from Elisa Del Rey, one of the few female voices that has always been a largely male enterprise, and whose interview for Futuro Anteriore is the first so far to be published in English. Footnote. Of the 58 individuals interviewed by Futuro Anteriore, 5 were women, probably a reasonable reflection of the gender balance within operaismo's history, although it must be said that not all of those interviewed, male or female, consider themselves to have been operaisti. End footnote. A workerist feminist whose political and theoretical work charted its own distinctive course from the 70s, Elisa Del Rey, who was also amongst those imprisoned as part of the notorious, quote, 7th of April case. Looking back over the past 25 years or so, Elisa Del Rey has this to say, quote, "Today, when I hear of the feminization of labor, affective labor, or immaterial labor, I laugh. It feels like they are joking because we used to say these things every day in the 70s when we imagined that there is a form of labor that is neither accountable nor measured and yet is what makes us productive. Makes us reproduce the labor power and allows for material production to take place, something without which material production is impossible. The fact that when it was emerging, the movement never made these issues its own allowed the capitalist productive structure a great advantage that we are now chasing after, because all current debates on immaterial labor, and I insist, affectivity, bracket, Tony calls it precisely that, as well as, quote, affection, end quote, and bracket, in production, are things that capital has already made operative. In this, there is another issue that women have long debated, and that, in my view, could correct, from a theoretical standpoint, this analysis of immaterial production. This is the issue of the body. This is not to say, quote, we have a body that we have to take care of because we have to be healthy. We are not happy with our body and so on, end quote. Capital has already talked about this. Our argument is rather that production is certainly immaterial, but production being immaterial cannot come into reality independently of bodies, end quote. Elisa Del Rey. The final words go to Paolo Virno, reflecting upon the early 90s when Luogo Comune and Futur Interieur developed different, yet in part complementary social analyses dissected with typical aplomb by Ferrari Bravo. Virno identified certain important limits within some variants of the early post-operaista project. Quote, its attention was always directed more to understanding, for better or worse, some guiding lights rather than truly facing up to the processes of class recomposition, with their ambiguity and character which, far from given, was often blocked, end quote. In a subsequent discussion with the authors of Futuro Anteriore, Virno suggests that since Seattle, there has been a growing, quote, representation and self-identification, end quote, of those layers of social labor power closest to the movements against global capital, quote, mass intellectual labor, linguistic labor, precarious labor, end quote, albeit often in a, quote, ethical, symbolic, end quote, sense. Noting that such layers have, quote, exploded the chain of class figures traditionally identified by operaismo, professional worker, mass worker, etc., he draws us back to, quote, one of the most interesting questions of the whole workerist tradition, even if it is rarely thematized as such. The form of struggle was the linchpin, bracket, zoglia, and bracket, connecting the class's technical composition and political composition. It lies at the heart of the various theories of organization. So the problem is how the movement can turn to the terrain of the relations of production, and therefore how, on the level of migrations, of intellectual property, of the social working day, it can damage and bring down the adversary, end quote. End quote. The book Empire famously presents the contemporary world system as one in which power is discentered, an assertion that has of late been subjected to increasing questioning. Whatever the truth of the matter, the time has come to examine critically the various threads stemming from operaismo in a similarly decentered way. Above all, this will mean judging each on its own merits as a contribution to comprehending contemporary global power relations as a whole, not simply those entailing, quote, some guiding lights, end quote. And so, in terms of how each such thread can best contribute to the collective project of, quote, damaging and bringing down the adversary, end quote. Thanks for listening.